You look better.
I feel better, thank you. Every day's getting better. Figured today would be a good day to talk about rye whiskey that has a higher amount of rye content in the mash bill.
But this isn't the highest.
This is not. So if you watched any of the videos or listened to anything before, you've got different levels of rye
And what are those
in the
levels?
mash bill.
Generally, there's 3, right?
Well, there's a combination, but generally, you're going to have your low rye mash bills, which are your barely legal Kentucky ryes, which are going to be 51 to 53% of the mash bill is going to be rye. Then you're going to step up into your higher rye mash bills, which are what these guys are. Now, these are not the full extent of them, but we're staying in the same state, so we're still staying in Kentucky. Where like an Old Forester is going to have about 60% of the mash bill be rye. You were kind enough to bring my glasses because I didn't want to mess this up. The Silver Springs is going to be 65% rye, 18 corn, 20% malted barley.
And this one has a really goofy name, like Sweet Rye, I think.
It does. So it definitely drinks. It's definitely sweet, even though it's got a 65% rye mash bill.
And then how much is the AO?
The Monagalea is going to be an 80% Monagalea rye with the 20% malted barley. So with the Silver Springs and with the A Overholt, this obviously has the most amount of rye at 80%, but with a 20% malted barley, it's going to change just the complexity of the whiskey. This has still got it. This is a high malt as well. So even though it's 65% rye, a high malt, which is 20% roughly, and then it's going to have corn in it as well. This is going to be 60%-ish of the mash bill's rye, still going to have corn, still going to have malted barley.
Why do you suppose that these two lean so heavily on the malted barley?
Well, that's what's going to set them apart, right? So that's like we've talked before. That's the fun thing about the rye world in particular, and same, it goes for bourbon as well. But it's just, they're trying to differentiate themselves from your everyday common run-of-the-mill thing, right? So that's the fun part about rye, is that's why it's so much fun to get into. I've said fun 4 times already, but there's so many different variations of playing within that mash bill, where like with a bourbon, like we've discussed before, you know, you're going to be 60 to 75-ish% of the mash bill is going to be corn. So then that doesn't leave you a whole lot of room to play with your rye, with your wheat, with your malted barley.
You have to work with the corn almost exclusively.
The corn, that's just bourbon. That's just the way it is. To get that sweetness, the 60 to 75% typically of the mash bill.
I had a gentleman asking me about that, like trying to point out the different tasting notes, and he listed 4 Kentucky straight bourbons back to back, and I said the difference between the 4 is going to be noticeable, but since you're just starting out, it's all going to taste pretty similar.
Yeah, and for a lot of people in the beginning, and that's what I used to tell people, try different legacy, because when you get into the stores, you know, I used to say try different legacy distilleries to kind of develop your palate and get your base established, because there's so many bottles on the shelves these days.
Indeed.
That if you're kind of new to whiskey and you don't know what you like or why you like it, or what you don't like or why you don't like it, and you spend an hour looking at the craft section, it's just too much, right? So I don't mind. I always suggested to people, go ahead, try some legacy stuff and build your base from there. So in the rye world, I thought these would be fun, because now we're going to get to see what a higher amount of rye in the mash bill can bring to the table. So these I necessarily wouldn't recommend for just people getting started in the rye world. We covered that the other day. But you'll see, you know, especially with the Old Forester and with the Silver Springs as well, because there's so much corn, these are still very approachable.
I find the Silver Springs rather delightful.
For bourbon drinkers, yes. Yeah, and we were lucky enough to we had nine separate single barrels of these Silver Springs at an event we went to, and it was a lot of fun to sit there and go through and pick apart the differences between each single barrel. Now, to be fair, if you can find the Silver Springs, at least here in Texas, I don't know about the distribution elsewhere, but they are all single barrels, even though it doesn't say on the label. But they've got a little
Oh, is that what that tag is?
little chingadette over here that tells you which cask number it is, which bottle out of the cask, excuse me, when it was bottled, and then the proof. So this is 118 proof. So it was one of my.
Hey, there's way more cherry in the Old Forester than I remember. Because I haven't had the Old Forester rye in a couple of years, I'd say.
Once again, it's there's a lot of corn in the mash bill. Old Forester's they distill using their giant column stills.
So you all have a lot of the cherry.
Yeah, it's definitely very, very bourbon forward, especially on the nose, right?
Although there is a bit of that spearmint gum
You
note.
can get a little bit of that spearmint gum note in there as well. It's subtle.
Yeah, that's why I say gum, not leaf.
Yes, correct. But let's give it a shot. The first whiskey of the day. Let's see what it tastes like.
As far as you know, I might have been drinking in the shower.
Now, this is 100 proof. First whiskey of the day. So obviously you get through that hug, and I usually tell people, don't judge a whiskey off the first sip. Get acclimated. But just on the first sip, excuse me, nothing crazy. It is
It's nice.
It is a little spicier because it's got obviously 60% ish of the mash bill is going to be corn. It's going to be rye, and it's got you're kicking up your proof into the 100 proof range. But going back on the nose, it's still very familiar to the first time we nosed it. Still very sweet.
If anything, I get more of the cherry on the what's this called, the retrograde?
On the retro, after you drink it and it gets down in you, then you go back. And you know this, but a lot of people maybe not know. But when you do nose things, you want to keep your mouth open just slightly. You don't want to necessarily nose it with your mouth closed. We want that air circulation to really be able to get the.
And of course, when you say mouth open, you mean like.
Yeah, we're not trying to catch flies.
Yeah, keep it
just slightly ajar.
Get a little intake.
Slightly ajar is a good way of putting it. Now that you're adjusted to the proof, a little more of that mintiness comes out.
Well, just a little bit.
Correct. Not overwhelming for me. Not overwhelming, but just sweet.
Sweet like gum. Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine like a nice little spearminty gum that's covered in that sugar that they put all over gum.
Oh yeah.
Which is why we don't chew gum, because we don't want to rot our teeth. But we'll drink bourbon. We'll drink rye whiskey as well.
Oh, it makes sense, because if you ever had gum that doesn't have that whatever that sugar is sprinkled over it, it tastes like nothing at all.
Yeah.
It tastes like you're chewing on
And now with an empty glass, though, if you go back, you're going to pick out a little more of that spearmintiness.
Funny enough, that's the residual.
Yep.
Do you put a lot of stock in the residual smell in the glass?
Sure, just because I think it's part of the experience. It's part of the fun, right? Swirl that around.
That's your third time saying fun in the last.
Yeah, I've got a thing today about fun. Maybe because I'm feeling so. You can pour. Sip your water. Yeah, maybe just because I'm feeling so much better with my brand new artificial hip.
Well, I'm all about having fun too.
I'm all about having fun.
Gonna get a few cocktails in me. Light a fire in someone's yard. Go to SeaWorld. Take my pants off.
Please. So now this is super unique. So
this one was really surprising when you brought it into the library for the first time.
Yeah, that was a fun one. So I'll tell the story briefly, just because it's a fun story. So when I started at the store I worked at, I know, right?
Fooling.
Those 4 bottles, label didn't really do a whole lot of justice.
The label doesn't do it any justice. If anything, it does it negative justice, because you look at it, it's kind of neat. It has a mermaid on it, but it says Silver Springs Sweet Rye. I don't know what that is.
Right. So, they're, marketing and whatnot, probably not their strong suit when they came out with it, but it was one of those bottles that I saw, didn't know what it was, had dust all over I think we had a case of them just sitting there, and they were so dusty that nobody ever bought them. I read a whiskey review about a similar bottle. I think it was a store pick that somebody had done. It sounded super interesting. Great backstory. I'm not going to get into the backstory right now, but it intrigued me enough. And I think at the time they were just trying to get rid of them because they had been on the shelf probably for, I'd say, a good year before I got there. And now it took me about 6 months before I read that article and actually got interested in it. But once I bought a bottle of it and took it home, I was like, holy crap, this is really good. It's a unique mash bill like we talked about, where it's a 65% rye, but it kicked in a little bit of corn, but it kicks up in the malted barley area, which is super interesting when it comes to
Which I do get on the nose.
Right.
You get that malty.
Correct. So obviously the difference between the Old Forester and this, other than 18 proof points, this is a much darker, more complex type of a rye whiskey. You're still going to get the mintiness, but
Say, do you describe that malty note as like a dough,
yeah,
like
I would.
or crayons?
I would almost say there's a bready note.
I got that too.
Almost like, and this is where we've talked about it with the Overholt before, where there's almost, with that higher malted barley content, there's almost that molassesy note to it. So this is almost, for me, more like a molasses bready note.
I can see that.
Right?
Yeah.
And with this particular single barrel, I don't get a lot of the traditional heavy baking spice of rye, or I'm not getting a lot of the mintiness just on the nose. I'm picking up a little bit because I know what it is, but if this was blind,
right,
you could almost be leaning towards just, you wouldn't really know what it was because of that heavy malt content, which
I would guess that it's what's it called? What's a high malt mash bill?
Well, so it goes back to the same rules. So some people might see this when you go into a store. So if you see, a wheat whiskey or a malt whiskey, and I'm thinking just right off the rip, Frey Ranch has a malt whiskey. High West has a malt. Woodford, I think it's the Blue Label. That's their malt whiskey. So it goes back to the rules of bourbon and rye.
Yeah.
So it goes back to bourbon. A minimum 51% of the mash bill for bourbon has to be corn. In the rye world, a minimum 51%.
I assume with malts it has to be.
Malt is going to be the same thing. Or if it's a wheat whiskey, 51% minimum has to be that. Although in the malt and the wheat world, you can play with all those different numbers depending on what you're trying to distill and what you're trying to make. So
to your health.
Yep, give this a shot. Now this is where the mintiness comes out.
Very much so.
We're on the nose, very malt forward, very bready. On the palate, that mintiness jumps out. Still sweet because there's corn in there.
When I go for the retrograde, most of the maltiness that I initially smelled has gone away and been replaced by what you would expect from.
Interesting, because for me, when I go back on that, I'm picking up more of the mintiness of it.
Yeah.
Still getting the breadiness, but the molasses to me has kicked down just ever so slightly, right? But very unique.
Very.
Still a rye whiskey.
It's very interesting.
Very unique, right? And that's one could almost argue that if you really want to be impressed, start playing in the rye world, because there's so many different offerings.
It's more volatile than
there's more
straight.
There's more room to play.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. In the bourbon world, like I said before, 60 to 75% of your mash bill is going to be corn. You're going to have some that are 90, like MGP. They make a 99.1 light whiskey, 99 corn, 1% malted barley.
Oh yeah, we've tasted that before, haven't we?
I don't think so. We saw one at a store one day
Yeah, right
when we
you
were
are.
hunting,
Right, you are.
and it was the company that does the like all the presidential stuff. I forget the name. I've got that 16-year-old Tennessee bottle there, but yeah, for the price,
What were they asking?
I think it was like $1.25, and I'm like $125 for barrel proof 99.1. I was good. I let it sit on the shelf.
It's interesting. Not as interesting as the $90 Smoke Wagon private barrel that you picked up.
Yes, that we got for the birthday the other day. That adds number 2 to the library, which is delicious. We'll do Smoke Wagon one day.
It's not enough, Dad.
I mean, just delightful. Spearmint, the breadiness, at least for me, has backed off a little bit.
I get a lot of breadiness on the empty glass.
Yep, and that's just that high malt content.
Funny about that is what lingers. Would you pass me the water?
Yeah, and luckily, like we said before, let me grab a little bit. We were able to do 9, I think it was 9 different.
It was just about 9.
9 different single barrels of this, all at different proofs. And you remember when we sat and did that, like just how wild. I mean, they were all similar, but just how different one barrel to the next, how different one barrel to the next was. So that's why I turned a few people onto these at the store I worked at here in Texas, and it's such a cool thing that a couple of them actually just drove around North Texas, picking up different casks, right? And that's how I got through one of my guys. That's how I got 9 samples of it.
That's funny.
But that was one of those if you know whiskeys, and I ended up,
Well, like you said, the bottle doesn't do it any favors.
right. But I ended up turning enough people onto it that we inevitably got more back.
But I believe
Unfortunately,
the price increase,
the
$15.
yeah. I mean, at a $45, $50 bottle, people were far less interested in buying it, obviously, as opposed to a $30 bottle. And then right before I left, before we moved down here, they had just lowered the price. And then people, because that's the thing in the whiskey world, especially like we've talked about before. If you can go into a store, find somebody you can trust, find somebody that's knowledgeable. If they can turn you on to something, fantastic. That's what you want to do. But like we've mentioned many a time, economics are economics. Now, since you mentioned the Smoke Wagon Private Barrel, the only reason we even bought that, A, it was my birthday, and B, that's been sitting in that store since last year.
Mm-hmm.
Why has it been sitting? Not because it's not great whiskey.
$90.
It's because it's $90. For the same reason that I bought one bottle, but my first private barrel, but
It's like that silly Sir Davis bottle that came out. The only reason that people paid out the nose for it is because it had Beyonce's name
yes,
slapped
it's
on it.
celebrity stuff, and I get it. Everybody's got to get paid, and that's fine. But unfortunately, you're looking at the reason that they still had that available at our local store here was strictly the price.
Yeah.
Because when we got them in, because I had one of the private barrels, the case that we got, I sold them all. But people trusted me.
It's simple economic theory. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down.
It does, unless you get somebody that's super knowledgeable that can kind of explain what Aaron from Smoke Wagon's doing.
And even then, you're going to have a smaller customer base, but that's fine.
And not everybody wants to spend $90 on said bottle. But I didn't mind it, A, because it was my birthday, and 2, we're going to have that bottle for years.
Although, without looking at the books of distilleries, I do think that the prices for most of the bottles I'm looking at here are overinflated.
Some are, although I just saw a thing the other day on Instagram, as a matter of fact, on Smoke Wagon's page. I know Instagram's not your favorite, but Aaron kind of predicted this a year ago, 2 years ago. He said he saw the demand for the higher dollar stuff going down, and he just posted the other day that his straight bourbon, and I believe it's called the Desert Colt. That's
their new variation of Uncut the Younger.
Yeah, but he just basically it's the straight bourbon at cask strength.
Oh, is that what they're
Correct.
doing with it now? Oh,
Yeah.
that's way better than whatever.
Yeah, and it's only, if I'm not mistaken, it's only like $6 or $8 more
I think so, yeah.
for cask strength. So, but he even
That's
said
nice.
on his Instagram that,
Shoot, I'll buy a bottle of
but
that.
those are his two best sellers. So where the uncut unfiltered used to be his best seller at, all approaching $80.
But that's when money was.
Well, that's when people had
was
some
fast.
money. Yeah. And I think even the last time I was at a store, the one here in one of the ones in Georgetown, I think they were even down to like $63
Really?
for a bottle of uncut unfiltered.
That's actually quite reasonable.
That it's getting better, but at almost 80, people would pass on it, and they would go for the because that's just economics.
But a
101.
few years ago, they wouldn't pass on it.
No,
People were jumping up and down to spend it.
No, yeah, 3-4 years ago, nobody would, bat an eye at a $70, $80 bottle of whiskey, $90 bottle. But economics are what they are. Everybody's just paying more attention and they're getting more educated.
And to be fair, we've theorized before that whiskey is on its way out of its popular phase.
Yeah, I don't know that it's out of its popular phase. We've talked about this before, but I really think that people are getting just more educated. There's 1 million whiskey review channels on the YouTubes, right? There's 1 million people giving their opinions about everything. We've talked about, I think that a lot of, the people that are hunting and flipping stuff, although the secondary market's coming down for sure, people are always going to hunt the E.H. Taylor single barrels. They're going to hunt the, uncut unfiltered single barrels, not single barrels, but the uncut unfiltered E.H. Taylors. Your Coy Hills, your Stags, your Eagle Rares. People are just going to gravitate to those no matter what. So even if you raise the price, people are still going to buy them because that's what people want.
Yeah.
But for kind of everybody else, it's like if you don't position yourself price-wise in the right slot, they're going to overlook that,
Sure.
right? Because of how much it's going to cost, especially with the advent these days of really good low-cost bourbons, right? Like an Old Forester 100, like a Benchmark.
Or, for example, a Overhaul, which is
Yep.
delicious and smells really interesting, and is also what, $35?
I believe it's right around there, at least in the state of Texas. It's right around. It's a 35-ish.
So walk with me
Let's
on the
call it
nose.
forward.
Shortbread.
Yeah, I would go back because we went from your kind of standard, single digit malt level
Mm-hmm.
to a higher malt, 20%. Is that what I said? I don't want to grab my glasses, but yeah, I think it's somewhere.
You can't see it.
It is 20%. No, I did see it.
You did see it?
Yeah, I did see it.
Okay.
So it's 20%. So we noticed a big jump up in the breadiness and the molasses notes with the Silver Springs, but we still had a lot of mint.
Uh-huh.
Where this one comes in, because there's no corn in it, it's just an 80-20. So 80% Montebello rye, which if people don't know, the East Coast was where rye whiskey was born.
Mm-hmm.
The reason being is rye does really well in rocky soil. And so Pennsylvania, Maryland, a lot of those regions back in the day, Virginia, they could grow rye there just without even trying. So kind of, and the fun story with A. Overholt, so there is a difference between the A. Overholt and just
old Overhaul.
the old Overholt. So Overholt was a distillery that was started around, it was whatever, 200
The
years
Revolutionary
ago.
War.
I believe so. I could be wrong. There's any historians.
Let's call the War of 1812.
Let's say they've been around a long time, and so what they did is they made Pennsylvania rye.
Yes.
And they made it 80% Montebello rye, 20% malted barley, right? Well, what happened after whatever happened, they were going out of business. Lo and behold, who buys the Overholt brand? Jim Beam. Right? So Jim Beam buys the Overholt brand.
Wait, it's all Jim Dean? Always has been.
But what happened was they said, you know what, with that 80-20 stuff, we don't want to do that. We're just going to do our typical 51 to 53% rye, corn, malted barley. So they just completely
Jump the recipe.
junked the recipe. So if you see an old Overholt, that's going to be
Very
similar.
nice as a screw top.
Correct, but that's going to be more of your 51 to 53% Kentucky Rye. It's still a ton of corn. The cool thing happened a couple years ago when through the TTB, they saw they were doing a new line called A Overholt.
Who's the TTB?
That's the people that are in charge of all the laws and stuff for whiskey or for alcohol in general. You have to submit your labels and all your stuff to them. But the cool thing is somebody from Jim Beam thought it was a good idea to resurrect how they used to make the Overholt back in the day.
And
so
that's this.
Correct. So they found a farmer in Pennsylvania in the Monongahela Valley to make this particular strain of Monongahela rye. They took it back to the original recipe, which is 80% Monongahela rye, 20% malted barley. And basically they just brought back what Overholt had done for the 100 years it was in operation before they went bankrupt.
So this is still owned by Jim Beam.
It's still owned by Jim Beam, but that's as close to drinking history as you're going to drink, because they went back and did everything pretty much the right way. Even bringing the bottle color back. Most bottles obviously they're in clear. That's in a black or very dark brown. But they just everything from the label to what's inside of it. So it was a really cool thing. Not a lot of people, if you look on the side where that triangle is, it kind of, I think it even tells you the farmer who grew the rye, maybe the other side.
I don't believe it says the farmer.
Look on the very side, no?
No, that says the name of the founder. And also we were close. Overholt Distillery was established in 1810.
1810. So now I just took a drink of this. The fun thing is, now that we're getting further away from the 60%, now we're getting to the 80%, but you're going to find this one is very similar with the breadiness and the molasses notes. And I really think that has to do with the malted barley content.
That would make sense. That's the only factor that's changing.
But then when you go back into it, you can find those minty notes, which are kind of cool, but not overpowering.
No.
Not overwhelming at all. But just very unique, very different.
Unlike in part 3 of this series, where we'll be diving into high rye whiskey, which will be Spearmint Junction.
Mm-hmm.
I really like A Overholt. The history's cool, but it's also a really, really quite delicious bottle.
Excuse me, it's got a great story. And the fact that people at Beam thought it was cool to bring back like an original recipe, that's pretty cool. It's a great story, and it's super unique, especially in the rye world.
It's very bready, just a dash of spearmint, but the spearmint plays kind of second fiddle to that breadiness. What else would you just
One of the big things I get is molasses.
Yeah.
A little light brown sugar type notes.
Just a smidge.
Yeah, but it's just something super cool. I think it's not the spiciest rye whiskey.
No, definitely not. That's probably tampered down by the barley.
It could be, and it could be just the trait of the Monongahela rye.
Could be. We'd have to smell the Monongahela rye.
To be fair, this is a 95 proofer, so proof-wise, it's not going to kill you for most people. But it's just an interesting mix on how it used to be. Like we've talked about before, you can have 100% rye whiskeys and
95.5.
Yep, all the way down to 51%. And it's just a cool thing to experiment with. So even just something like this, very findable.
Not so findable.
In the state of Texas, you can, I think depending on the store up in Dallas, these were still everywhere.
Okay.
I don't think down here in Georgetown I don't think I've seen those.
I haven't. Maybe down in Round Rock or closer to Austin.
Perhaps. Now, to be fair, we didn't get into the backstory, but I think when those bottles are gone, they're gone. Because they only had set amount of bottles, because they didn't distill their own.
Are they shutting down?
No, they sourced their whiskey from another company. There's a whole big backstory that goes into it that I'm not going to get into. But But still, even if you went from just the Old Forester to the A Overall, it's a nice change, right? When you're stepping up into the higher rye content. So if you can find them, give it a shot. They don't break the bank, and as your palate develops, especially these two are super fun because you're getting that higher malted barley content, which is always kind of fun and new for most whiskey drinkers. But yeah, comparing the three, they're fantastic. It's a lot of fun, and if you can find them, grab them.